Hello and welcome to DNA Today. I'm your host, Kira Deneen. DNA Today is a show that's going to inform you on what's happening in the world of genetics. The show is packed with news stories, lessons, all to keep you updated on the world of genetics and all of that. So this may sound intimidating. I know a lot of people don't know a lot about genetics, but I'm going to give you a couple disclaimers right away so you don't get scared off. I promise you it's not a dense show. Anyone can listen and follow along. Here's another disclaimer, biggest one. I'm not an expert. I'm a UConn student. I'm interested in the field of genetics and will be learning right along with you. These news stories are what I'm researching and what I'll be digesting on air with you. I find genetics fascinating. The most interesting part about genetics is the potential in the medical field as well as other fields, but mostly the medical field. So I'll have a few lessons in here, but most of the episodes are going to be focused on news and genetics. There will be some lessons on like the structure of DNA or different processes going on or what researchers are doing, but most of it, again, is the news stories. And it's all in an easy to understand language. You don't really need to know a whole lot about genetics to be able to listen to the show and follow along with what I'm saying because, again, I'm not an expert, but hopefully someday I will be. So this is my first show on WHUS Stores, so I'm very excited about being a host here. I've been producing podcasts for a little over 3 years, so I have a little experience with microphones, but not much else. And I began podcasting with Hunger Games podcast back in 2011, which I still continue. You can check that out at nightlockpodcast.com. And since I'm on the topic of plugging websites, the website to this show is dnapodcast.com. And you can check us out on Twitter at DNA Podcast. And radio is a whole new platform for me, as I said, and I'm really excited about all I'll be doing here. This is just the beginning. So I'm going to kick off the show with 3 news stories. Then we'll get to a lesson on the basics of the molecule the show's named after, DNA. And I'll talk about personalized medicine and maybe finish up with geneticist of the week. So our first segment here is Genetic Roundup. The first International Genealogy Conference took place a few days ago on August 15th. Ended in the 17th there, in Chevy Chase, Maryland. The event was hosted by the Institute for Genetic Genealogy. The event focused on autosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and some X and Y chromosome research. And speeches included talk also of DNA from different races, such as Irish, African American, Native Americans, kind of what was listed in the pamphlet. The keynote speaker was Dr. Spencer Wells, who spoke about the Genographic Project. And I'll take this opportunity to get to know the little project a little bit better. The Genographic Project aims to use human genetics to analyze DNA to better understand where we originated from and how we populated the Earth. The Genographic Project launched in 2005 by National Geographic. They're studying haploid groups, which I didn't know what these were before the show, so I'll let you know. Haploid group is a branch of the human family tree. So everyone, including you and me, belongs to a haplogroup based on the genetic markers you carry in your cells. And that's what this project is about. It's helping people figure out which haplogroup they belong to and tracing their descendants to a common ancestor to find a specific place where that ancestor may have lived. And last night when I was doing this research, it was really cool on the website. It says that there's 678,632 people that have participated in this project. Now, this number might have gone up from 12 hours ago. If you want to see what the number's at now, you can go to genographic.nationalgeographic.com. So I'm wondering how often they update that or if it's like an automatic thing, but it's cool to see that they have that many people already involved. As the project launched in 2005, and if you want to learn more about this project, as I don't want to spend the entire show talking about it, but if you want to learn more, you can go onto Netflix. They have an awesome movie documentary on there that is called The National Geographic, The Human Family Tree. I was watching it the other night, and it was really easy to follow along. Sometimes you start watching a documentary, and you realize that it's not for the average person to watch, but it was easy to follow along and very interesting to see how they're going about doing all of this. So if you don't get around to it, this weekend, you can put it in your queue. Always a great place to stock up for a rainy day. And their website also has a lot of information, genographic.nationalgeographic.com. So you can check out there to see more about what they're doing and future plans and all of that. And a little thing I'm going to want to do during the genetic roundup is ending each news story by answering 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why, of the news story. This one was a little bit shorter, but for the long news stories, like I'll get to, it can kind of get you can kind of get bogged down in the details of things. So being able to kind of clearly identify what the news story is about will help us in the future. So WHO, the first International Genealogy Conference, kind of mouthful, had a keynote speech about the National Geographic, and that was the first one that happened just a week ago. So again, genetics, it's happening. It's exploding. What the National Geographic Project is called the Genealogy Project. When the project launched in 2005 and is still active, having collected, again, I'm going to butcher this number here, 678,632 people, genetic information. And you can actually see them doing this. They were doing it in New York in the Netflix documentary I mentioned before. And that was really cool because they chose that because so many different races live in New York. So it's kind of a great hub to collect all kinds of different genetic information. And it makes sense. And it's close to us here in Stores. And the last question, why? Why is this project happening? Well, the Genealogy Project aims to use human genetics by analyzing DNA to better understand where we originated from and how we populated the Earth. So you got some human geography in there combined with genetics. A lot of these news stories we're talking about how genetics is combining with something else. And as this next story is. And this next story is about finding a new gene. Now I'm going to call it now. I would say I'm probably going to have at least one news story a week about finding a new gene because that's the bulk of the news in genetics is finding a new gene and figuring out what it's for and all of that. So maybe I'll take it on as a challenge to try and find one every week. The newly discovered gene of the week, maybe a new segment. So how can humans survive at a high altitude where most mortals suffer from oxygen deprivation? Well, as I already kind of gave it away, they have a mutated gene. This mutation happened around 8,000 years ago to the Tibetans who actually thrive in the high altitude environment of the Tibetan Plateau. Here the elevation is 14,800 feet. And this information has come out of a study by the University of Utah, and it was published in the journal Nature Genetics, which, by the way, is a ton of awesome articles that are new studies coming out and everything. This just came out recently. I want to say August 17th. Probably have the information later in my doc here. But what's great about Nature of Genetics is it really does cover a lot of what's happening in the world of genetics. The downside is it's very hard to read. Having only taken a few college-level molecular classes, I'm sure I could figure it out eventually if I kind of sat there and deciphered through it, but it is hard to read for an average person, so it's better to kind of Google. You could find the article and then Google what it was about to someone to kind of water it down for you a little bit, which is what I had to do. But yeah, you can also check out the website itself is nature.com. But the study I'm talking about here, about the Tibetans, was led by, I'm going to butcher his name, Joseph Prikal. And Joseph Prikal is an internist, which is specializing in internal medicine, and a hematologist, which is a medical specialist in the field of blood and blood-forming tissues. So these combined expertise certainly helped as the study took blood samples from Tibetans. And the participants lived in Utah and Virginia, as well as other Asians living in China and India. Took a couple different populations, I guess, to really get a good stance on what makes the Tibetans different of being able to live in this high elevation. So here's the part that blows my mind. The researchers found the gene. Now, this isn't what blows my mind. It happens a lot. It's still very cool, but they found the gene EGLN1, which was altered, and they have that was the mutation. So the Tibetans have a mutated version of this gene. The gene is called EGLN1. So they've concluded that the Tibetans are able to breathe normally in this high elevation, and it's this one gene, which usually it's multiple genes that cause something to be different, especially something as big as this, being able to survive easier in a high elevation environment. But it's not just the one gene that like the whole gene was different. it was only one DNA base pair of genetic letters. And if you guys can remember these from bio class, they're A, C, T, and G, and they're how the genetic language is written. All it took was one single base pair to cause this difference. And that's what blows my mind, because having a single base pair change an entire way of being able to live is amazing. And this happened, again, 8,000 years ago, and we're able to track this. So what this mutation actually does is it causes more red blood cells to be produced. So people without this genetic mutation suffer at high altitudes because the low levels of oxygen in the air. People's blood becomes thicker with red blood cells. Again, recall that red blood cells carry oxygen throughout your body. That's, one of their main purposes. So because of the red blood cells are trying very hard to carry oxygen all over the body where tissues are in low supply of the oxygen, the body has to work much harder to maintain a normal state, like homeostasis is what that's called. So the Tibetans who produce more red blood cells have an easier time delivering oxygen throughout the body because they have more red blood cells. That's what this gene is doing. So for those that do not have this mutation, it can lead to many long-term complications as severe as heart failure. This example of one base pair changing where someone can live is a perfect example of evolution, which is, I think, what they were getting at when they were doing the study, is to see why they're different and they're evolved, I wouldn't say more, but maybe differently than an average human, because most humans don't live 14,000 feet above sea level. But these people thrive with this mutation in this, for us, harsh environment. So if they pass this on to their children, who are more likely to survive because of this, then they pass it on to their children, so on and so on. 8,000 years later, now here we are. But the people that didn't carry this mutation would most likely develop a long-term condition that leads to something like heart failure. And if you compare the portion of the population with the mutated gene and then the mutated list, I'm going to come up with that word, the mutated list gene portion of the population, they wouldn't produce as well because someone would die before they had a chance to reproduce, or if they did reproduce, their children might die early, or they might die before they got the chance to reproduce. Therefore, the mutated gene portion of the population were naturally selected to survive over the mutated list portion of the population because they survived better, so they're going to be stronger and be able to withstand that high elevation. So this gene mutation is only an advantage, though, in high-level elevation, let's remember, because on or below sea level, this genetic mutation does not give people an edge to survive. Having more red blood cells brings more oxygen throughout the body, but that's going to help in high elevation. Low elevation, not really going to do too much. So it's easy to believe that it would not have been present on sea level because you don't need it to survive. So if you had it, it wasn't going to give you an edge. So it's supported in this study that now 88% of Tibetans have this genetic variation, but this gene mutation is rare in closely related lowland Asian people. So 88% of Tibetans have this, and it's very rare for Asians to have it. So that really shows that this gene really did help them survive, and that's what leads us to this conclusion, based comparing the DNA from Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Mongolians, and Filipinos against the Tibetan DNA. So you can read the published study on nature.com, as I mentioned before. Get through it. It was published about a week ago on there. Again, it is dense, so if you're not fluent in molecular jargon, it's interesting, but it's going to be a little difficult for you to get through. All right, so the 5 W's to end this news story. Who? Joseph Prakal from the University of Utah is leading this project. He is an expert in internal medicine and blood-forming tissue. The fancy names for this is internist and hematologist. Now, what? The project studied the differences between the Tibetan people who live in high altitudes and people that live at sea level. They found that a base pair mutation occurred which increased the red blood cell production, making it easier for the body to transport oxygen throughout the body in an environment where there's low levels of oxygen. When? This project was just published in the academic journal Nature on August 17th, and where the participants that were studied are the Tibetan people who lived in high elevations. Their DNA collected was compared to people that live at sea level to see if they had the mutated gene and why. The study was conducted to learn more about evolution and now serves as a prime example, so it was very successful. So our last news story, and the main one I've been leading up to, is how involved Google is with genetics, which surprised me. I was doing research and Google came up when I Googled genetics. Google has been undergoing a research study called Google Baseline, which just started this summer in 2014. The project overall aims to understand the genetics behind a healthy person. So they're not looking at someone that has a disease, they're flipping it. They're looking at someone that's healthy. This project is a part of Google X, and for those of you that don't know, Google X is a kind of secret section of Google that works on producing major technical advancements, anywhere from 70 to 80 experts working on this project. Google X, not necessarily the project within Google X, which is Baseline, but we have 70 to 100 experts in this subdivision of Google called Google X. And they're from an array of fields, biochemistry, optics, imaging, and molecular biology, and obviously being computer savvy and all of that. So it isn't just a bunch of computer programmers running the show. There are many different types of minds, which helps when there's a project with different components like this one, that you have genetics where that's science, but you're using computers to analyze that. Google X is only about half a mile away from Googleplex, which is Google's headquarters. In Mountain View, California, the director of daily activities, Astro Teller, described Google X as, quote, science fiction sounding solutions, which I love. Things that we talk about on here is going to sound like science fiction, like it's right out of the movie Gattaca, which is an awesome movie, by the way. You have to see it. I believe that one's on Netflix, too. But goes on to say, focuses on problems that affect millions of people in their daily lives and try to tackle them through a completely new perspective. I think Google's kind of known for thinking out of the box and looking at things a little differently, which is working for them and hopefully will work for them on this project. Google isn't tackling this massive project alone, though. They are teaming up with Duke University and Stanford University medical schools. So again, to be clear, Google X is the section of Google that is working on Google Baseline. Google Baseline is the project. Enyo Condrad is the person running the project, Google Baseline. He recently explained his thoughts behind the project to the Wall Street Journal, saying, we are just asking the question, if we really want to be proactive, what would we need to know? You need to know what the fixed, well-running thing should look like. Of his most notable work is pioneering cheap HIV tests for use in blood plasma donations, and hopefully soon he'll be better known for his work with Google Baseline. It seems silly to study the genes of a healthy person at first, but if you think about it, it's actually very innovative. By twisting the perspective, it gives the scientists and doctors a baseline, as the name says, to what genes should be operating like, should look like. It gives us a starting point. So through this project, Google is looking primarily for biomarkers that are found in healthy people. The Wall Street Journal uses this example to help us understand. If a biomarker for breaking down a fatty food was present in a healthy person, it may not be present in someone who isn't as healthy, and that's where we begin to distinguish between the two. The doctors could probably test to see if the patient has this marker, this biomarker. If not, they may need to modify their lifestyle and diet to avoid building up the fat. So by understanding what a healthy person's genes look like and taking a lot of different samples to kind of come up with the most ideal healthy genes, then we can see in someone that is diseased what is different. And what is different is probably causing the disease or has a major cause to it. But before I get ahead of myself, let's review what biomarkers are. And since we're talking about Google, it seems fitting to use Google's definition. Quote, a measurable substance in an organism whose presence is indicative of some phenomenon such as disease, infection, or environmental exposure. That last part's important. It's not just what you're born with, but it's also what you've been exposed to. It's not just looking at genes, but how our experiences have affected our health. So if you're running a lot and you're active compared to just watching TV all the time, you're going to have different biomarkers. So this is kind of a new thing that we're not just looking at, what you're born with. It's on top of that, it's nature nurture. The mindset here of Google Baseline is that we should know how a proper system works if we want to understand what the difference in a body is that's not properly functioning, as I said before. We're establishing this baseline. If we know what working genes look like, then we can clearly identify what non-working genes are looking like. And with the information learned through Google Baseline, it may be easier to use this method to, again, identify differences and therefore genes that don't work, and diagnosing diseases becomes easier. And hopefully we can even catch diseases in people so treatment can start earlier, more lives can be saved. And in an ideal world, we could diagnose diseases before symptoms even start occurring because we could see what genes they have and say, oh, let's hold off on this, or we should start this treatment to prevent them actually having pain. And again, it sounds like science fiction, but it could be in a reality in our near future. And Dr. Conrad, again, who's the leader of the project, admits that the project is headed into the unknown. The human body is still unknown, even though we're rapidly learning more, especially in genetics. The complexity still has baffled us at some points. And for the project, the relationship between DNA, enzymes, and proteins, as well as environmental factors, like I mentioned before, are all influencing the human body. And Google wants to explore this and add more to our knowledge. And as I said before, the project is just starting out and has plans to take data from 175 people, but there are further plans to increase this number to 400 by the end of the year and even further into the thousands in the future. When the data of the participants is collected, as standard produce states, it must be anonymized before being analyzed. Should be a quote. These participants volunteer and obviously have to give informed consent to be part of the study. Participants of the project will contribute body fluids, including blood and saliva. Most interesting part is that their DNA is sequenced, which, I mean, we could guess that, but that's going to be most of the project. And other information acquired will be family genetic history, their heart rate, digestion, reaction to drugs, other biological data. And Google is on the lookout to find biomedical markers, again, of the person's experience on the body. And they're doing this through the genes, but also other influences and body fluids. So it's not just the genetics, as I keep mentioning, or even just the environmental factors. It's really the chemistry of the human body that Google's trying to figure out. If we know the normal state of chemistry in the body, it can be identified when there is a chemical imbalance, because we'll know what the original balance was. And since Google headquarters is located in the U.S., it makes sense that the project is only occurring within the U.S. Currently, this probably will expand. Hopefully it will expand. An interesting aspect of this is the participants will be informed they're part of a clinical study, but not necessarily as part of Google Baseline study. And Google Baseline itself is not conducting the clinical aspect of the project. They're going to have a partner help them complete this. I would guess it's probably the medical school, as I mentioned before. And obviously there's concerns that comes with this, as any major project is in the medical field, especially as groundbreaking as this hopefully will be. There are privacy concerns of how secure all this information is, and if the information is leaked out, how it would affect the participants, especially if they were revealed, and how it could affect their health insurance. If their health insurance finds out, oh, you test positive for this gene, are you going to get this gene? And then your health insurance doesn't want to cover you anymore. So that's kind of another Gattaca situation. And I keep bringing up Google because, again, they're the main force behind this project. They're financially launching the project, and the data analysis ability of Google, as you can imagine, is a monumental gain for this project, and it's really expensive for academics to have access to. And just to put it in perspective, it now costs around $1,000 to sequence a human genome. Now, obviously, they're doing way beyond this. They're not just going to sequence the DNA and put it in a folder, but now it's $1,000. Now get this, it used to cost an outstanding $100 million 14 years ago. Only 14 years. I'm not talking about 100 years. 14 years, it goes from $100 million to 1,000. So we're rapidly making progression in this field. And Google's presence in the project is going to make computer analysis portion much more efficient than, I would guess, a traditional computer analysis company, because it's Google, the king of search engine. And there's been failed attempts in the past for projects like these due to money, but with Google behind it, I think it probably has some more momentum and promise for real results. Another aspect that makes this unique for Google X is that it does not produce a product for consumers at the end of the project. It's also an ongoing project with not a whole lot of set future plans. It's an oddball, but arguably one of the more important Google X projects, Some other ones, they're working on contact lenses, kind of similar to the Google Glass. So that's maybe more interesting to the general public. But as for the medical field, especially genetics, I would say Google Baseline is where it's at. And you might wonder why Google's taking this on. It's not really in the medical field, but that's probably why. They're trying to get their foot in the door of the health industry, and it could be their next big takeover. If they did take over the health industry, in 2017, it's valued to be at $10.8 trillion. That's how much it's going to be worth worldwide. And by the looks of it, Google wants to get ahead of this, because if you start a project and you get in there, you're ahead of everyone else. And there's not a definite ending date to this project, but it's hard to predict, like a project like this, what's really going to happen and if the plans they have they'll stick to, as science is ever changing. So it's hard to predict those sort of things. All right, so the 5 W's to end the show. Who? Google X, a section of Google that works on developing major technology advances, has a new project, Google Baseline, and they're working on what? They're looking to learn more about the healthy genome to help identify diseases that differ from the healthy genome. They're doing this by looking for patterns in genetics and biomarkers to indicate differences in the body of healthy people and people that are ill. The project just started when? In the summer of 2014, a couple months ago. And it could go as long as 10 years, maybe even more. Where is it taking place? Half a mile outside of Googleplex headquarters. And why? Because we want to understand why a healthy person is healthy. And we're looking at their genes and biomarkers, specifically of environmental factors, to see why they are healthy. Because there's got to be a chemical reason, right? Well, that about wraps it up for the show today. Just got to the news, so we'll have to save the rest for next time. Again, my name is Kira Deneen, and this is DNA Today, where we talk about the news happening in DNA today. And I will be on every week, Mondays at 1, except for next week. That's my only one that I miss out on. There's going to be a women's soccer game, so tune in for that. It's going to be against Syracuse. So 2 weeks from today, I'll be back on WHUS Stores Air. If you're interested in learning more about the show and genetics, you can go to dnapodcast.com for more lessons, not only in audio format, but in a written format as well if you're a visual learner. There's a contact form on there. Send in feedback. Want to know what you thought about the pilot episode. And you can also email in directly at info@dnapodcast.com. If you want to keep in contact with the show, see what we're up to, see what we're posting about, you can check out us on Facebook and Twitter, both at /DNA Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Kira Deneen at KIRADINEEN. Thanks for listening, and join me next episode to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.